Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Stephanie Cristello. I'm the Director of Programming here at EXPO Chicago, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of The Scene, Chicago's International Journal of Contemporary and Modern Art. On behalf of everyone at EXPO Chicago, I want to welcome you to the 7th edition, and most especially welcome you to the Dialogues program, which is presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues is a year-round program of provocative artistic discourse, conversations, and panel discussions with leading artists, curators, and arts professionals on the current issues that engage them. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Symposium, which is a highlighted component of the full Dialogues program. I had the pleasure of curating this today's series of conversations, and the entire symposium is entitled Present Histories, Art and Design in Chicago. The symposium traces provocative positions that Chicago's alternative models have shaped and continue to impact internationally across fields of art, design, and culture. Looking at the term present, both as an act of portrayal and demonstration, as well as a tense of being current, the symposium will focus on how certain movements have founded in the city and have been generated, assimilated, and reimagined within our contemporary moment. A special thank you must go to our core partner for this event, the Terra Foundation for American Art, and their initiative, Art Design Chicago. Without their support, none of today's panels would have been possible. This panel, entitled Making the Modern Image, Mid-Century Commercial Industry in Chicago, features Theaster Gates, whose recent exhibition, A Johnson Publishing Story at the Rebuild Foundation, explores the enduring role of Ebony and Jet magazines in defining and popularizing a Black aesthetic and identity around the globe. Corinne, Granof, and Amy Beste are going to be speaking on the work of Goldsholl and Associates, whose films, television ads, and other moving image work innovated designs in film, influenced by László Moholy-Nagy and the Bauhaus approach. Historian Lara Allison will be speaking on the seminal legacy of the Great Ideas campaign by the Container Corporation from 1950 to 1980. And the discussion will be moderated by Michael Golec, Associate Professor of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our final panel for the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Stephanie already made all of the introductions, so now I really don't have much to say. But I do have a few opening remarks, and then what we'll have is our panelists will do roughly 10 to 15-minute presentations in the order of Lara, Corinne, Amy, and finally Theaster. And then we'll open up for questions and dialogue with all of you. It would appear that a varied and heterogeneous history of Chicago design has been difficult to define, especially where its ostensible contributions to the constructions of an image that define the mid-century aesthetic are concerned. Somehow, we always find ourselves stuck in the early 20th century with the new Bauhaus and its modernist legacy. This is made all the more challenging where the question of legacy has as much to do with a celebration of inherited knowledge and skill emanating from a singular source, resulting in repression and erasure. I want to propose that what's at stake in addressing Chicago design legacies is not what matters in the sense of staying true to an inheritance, as if one were to pantomime a past, but how inheritance and the questions it raises challenges us to stay focused on what matters for each of us today. As our panelists will attest to this evening, Chicago design is characterized by variety, proliferation, and instability. This is the case even where the new Bauhaus and Institute of Design still loom large. And as much as it is invested in accounts of design, production, and consumption of objects and images, the study of Chicago design is equally concerned with processes, networks, and connections as they form wide-ranging multiplicities in terms of local, national, and international influences. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Lara Allison, who will be presenting on the Legacy of Great Ideas campaign by the Container Corporation from 1950 to 1980. And Lara is a lecturer in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Lara.
Thank you, Michael. So let me pull up some slides here to start. Okay, here's one of the images from the campaign. So Michael asked us to kind of organize around current projects that we're working on, and a project that I'm dealing with currently deals with advertising graphics during the Cold War in the United States. And I came to the project really through Container Corporation and through my dissertation, which dealt with the Institute of Design, School of Design, New Bauhaus, and its institutionalization in Chicago, mostly in the commercial field. So I looked at exhibition display, commercial design, and marketing. Chicago-based packaging company, Container Corporation of America, became an important site for my research. It was a company that was formed in Chicago in 1926 by a man named Walter Pepke. And he basically took over his father's lumber company and turned it into a paperboard packaging company, and then eventually turned it into a design research company with research for packaging for clients who were using packaging. It was one of several Chicago companies that was supportive of the School of Design and the New Bauhaus, and the belief that this type of school would have relevance to commercial applications following the Depression. So the company's Great Ideas of Western Man advertising campaign, and it eventually became kind of also, there were incorporation of other ideas, Eastern Man, and it became kind of larger as the series went on, and so was more often referred to as the Great Ideas. But early on, it was referred to as the Great Ideas of Western Man advertising campaign, and it ran, as Michael said, between roughly 1950 and 1980, and is a focus of my current project. This particular series, the company was doing innovative advertising, hiring modern, European mostly, but also American designers and artists from around 1936, 1937. This particular series represented a kind of distinctive moment in its advertising campaign history. It was also one of the longest running advertising campaigns for the company. And it wasn't really avant-garde. I mean, there were many of the ads that were just not avant-garde at all, that were, for a couple of reasons. One is many members of the European avant-garde that had come over to the United States had turned away from their earlier kind of principles and practices. But two, and importantly, as I argue in my broader project, that this campaign marked Pepke's move away from his kind of alliance with the School of Design and Moholy-Nagy and towards another Bauhaus figure, Herbert Matter, who wasn't based in Chicago, but who played a very important role at the company as a design consultant and a close friend of Pepke's. So the Great Ideas represented Container Corporation's move towards also non-rational advertising. As you can see, the logo and the name of the company is right here down at the very bottom, but the idea that is represented, an idea taken from Alexander Hamilton's ideas on justice and republic, have nothing to do with actually what the company sold or did, or anything to do with really its products and processes. Rather, it linked it to something that that was kind of larger than the company itself, basically the Western intellectual tradition as derived from the Encyclopedia Britannica 54-set volume of the Great Books of the Western World, which was published in 1952. So here in this advertisement, this is one that was done by Herbert Matter. Matter contributed more advertisements to the series than any other designer. He reduces, here are some of the elements. I'm sorry, every time I turn the thing. He reduced some of the elements of his early photographic work done in Germany to graphic form in an image that communicated clearly the meaning of the words by Hamilton, which read, if you can't see it, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of society against the injustice of the other part. So here Matter uses this kind of guarding eye overlooking the two parts of society in tension with one another, shown by these outturned hands and these arrows coming together. What these advertisements chart is the transformation of the relationship between the corporation and the public, as well as the reorganization of corporations' organizational structures following the Second World War, and the interest in the part of company founders or leaders to present an ideal behind which a corporation could express itself, or its personality, or its character. The great idea behind this campaign and others like it was that the corporate leaders articulated their feeling of responsibility to public life through the main medium through which they connected with the masses, which was corporate identity and expression. Another example of the kind of work that I will talk about in my larger project, not so much here because it's not as Chicago-based as the Container Corporation, is IBM. This is the Mathematics Serving Man series, same kind of idea as the Great Ideas, running around the same time. The designer for this series is Roy Kuhlman, and it basically takes this notion of an idea and connecting it to the corporation. Here, a mathematical idea, the idea of zero. Oh, I actually didn't want that in there, sorry. This is another image from the Container Corporation's Great Ideas. This is the first advertisement that ran in Time magazine. So the campaign took off around mid-1950 and was run in Fortune magazine. All of its advertising campaigns were run in Fortune up to this time. And then very quickly, Pepke and his design team decided to run them in more mass circulating magazines, magazines that were not published every month, but rather every week, such as Time and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report, as was the case with the IBM Math Serving Man. And so this was, I think, interesting because Fortune has a kind of stature in terms of like design. It has a kind of very high standards in quality paper and so on. Time magazine is quite different, and there was this kind of interesting juxtapositions that would happen, and that would cause this kind of, I would imagine, this kind of disjunctive experience when you're reading these magazines. So for example, on the other side of this particular advertisement is one for Camel cigarettes. As the Cold War heated up and Americans debated their country's roles overseas in Asia and Europe, Herodotus here peers from the past to remind Americans of the values that united them within the broader goal of democratic liberalism. The entire campaign and the great books movement on which it was based was part of the effort to repair or unify the tendencies to divide, polarize Americans by setting forth a program to guide their thinking of their own individuality and its role within a democracy. In this sense, the campaign can be read not only in terms of the Cold War and the fight to push for democratic liberalism throughout the world and to contain the spread of communism, but also as a reaction and counter to collective movements, labor movements and other collective movements in the US. Sorry, these got a little bit mixed up, so I'm just going to have to go back and forth a little bit here. Whoops. Okay, for Herbert Bayer, this is another one of Herbert Bayer's designs for the campaign. This was one kind of way that he dealt with the interpretation of these quotations or these ideas. This was a quote from Thomas Jefferson from 1816, which reads, "We both consider the people as our children and love them with parental affection, but you love them as infants whom you are afraid to trust without nurses, and I as adults whom I freely leave to self-government." And so this kind of typographical solution, for one, I mean, it's very distinctive from Herbert Bayer's earlier kind of typographic experiments that were much more kind of mechanical and less hand-painted or had less of a kind of hand quality to them. But I think what's interesting about the typographical solutions is that the context really becomes lost in which the original quote took place. There's no kind of reference to the past, to the author, or something like that. So, for example, this particular quote was from a letter that Jefferson had written to a French government figure who was a close friend of his. and who had emigrated to the United States during the French Revolution, but printed in the context of the Cold War. The we, you, and I, of course, migrate to other meanings. So one thing that I'm kind of thinking about as I work on this project is, how would these have been read by a post-war reader of Time magazine or Newsweek? How could one separate these statements and expressions and ideas from the social and political context in which they appeared? Some of these I didn't actually want in here. Okay, I'm going to go to this one very quickly. In some cases, it practically appears that a specific advertisement was, and quotation were meant to coordinate with specific news or editorial focus of a particular issue of a magazine, such as Time. So in the opening letter for the publisher in which this particular advertisement appeared in Time in May 11, 1959, is a reflection on the importance of the free press and journalistic pursuit of truth. In this issue appears Magritte's interpretation of John Milton's idea on the victory of truth. So this advertisement is unusual, and I didn't kind of go into detail here, but there was this kind of tension. Herbert Bayer, who was very involved with the campaign early on, found it difficult to kind of find contemporary painters who could provide the visual element for the campaign because of the kind of context in which the avant-garde movements were kind of emerging at this time, but I didn't want to get too much into that. But this also points the way that this work was run. This is a work by René Magritte. Also suggests the kind of challenge that some of the art directors and designers dealt with when dealing with painting. So along the side here, you can't read it, it's very small text, it's really disruptive to the actual reading of the advertisement, is an interpretation of René Magritte's interpretation of the quote. So you have this kind of layering. And so graphic designers who were very involved in this campaign kind of, I think, felt that the best solutions were kind of graphic ones in most cases. I'm going to conclude with two final images which aren't next to each other for some reason, but they're both by Herbert Matter. This is by a photograph of Lincoln, showing a message from his message to Congress from 1861. And this is one traditional approach that was used to kind of by designers and artists in this campaign, which was to provide a straightforward portrait, illustration, or photographic of the author of the idea, as we see here. Yet I think Matter's kind of saturation of the portrait and this kind of burnt yellow aligns it kind of with pop art. And this ran in the first decade of the campaign. And this is another one by Montesquieu, which I thought would be a good lead-in to Corinne and Amy's talk. And this is a color transparency that he produced for an idea from Montesquieu from The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748. Matter employs abstract photographic transparency. Its expressionism would align it with the abstract painters that Herbert Bayer felt strongly could not effectively communicate ideas or provide an expression for corporate identity. Yet the suggestion of free movement of form here captures the essence of the quote, which reads, "Countries are well cultivated, not as they are fertile, but as they are free." Montesquieu, who wrote in 1734 Considerations of the Causes and of the Greatness and Decadence of the Romans, reflected on the decline and death of democratic government as it abandoned its original principles to give way to dictatorship. His Spirit of the Laws influenced the philosophy of the American Constitution. It is interesting to note that many of the European emigres who contributed to this campaign, including Herbert Matter, witnessed in Europe during the 1930s the abandonment of democracy during the rise of fascism. The ethereal quality of this image, suggesting not only freedom of movement, but also temporality and fragility, suggested to its readers the idea that no democracy should be taken for granted as a permanent state. And so that concludes my kind of quick run through, and I'm going to hand it over to Corinne and Amy.
Thanks so much, Lara. Our next presenters, Corinne and Amy.
So we're going to tag team because we are co-curators of the exhibition that opened at the Block Museum last week called Up is Down. And just before we start, we want to thank you so much for inviting us to talk about this project, and thank also the Terra Foundation for supporting our research and installation of the exhibition. So yeah, the exhibition, as I said, it just opened at the Block Museum, and it features the work of Morton and Millie Goldsholl, who were pioneering designers, artists, filmmakers. They worked in television at their firm Goldsholl Design Associates from about the 1930s. Well, actually, the firm was founded in the 1950s through the 1970s. And it presents a largely unknown history, Chicago history of design, and a little bit of their legacy. What you're looking at in our kind of billboard image here is a still from a 1959 film called Faces and Fortunes, which they created. It was a very innovative project in film on corporate identity. And the title of the exhibition came from a film by Millie Goldsholl that is featured in the exhibition, but just also generally refers to the work of the Goldsholls and the way they turned advertising convention on its head. So here's a picture of the firm from 1963. You see Morton and Millie, the principals and founders, on the far left. And although at the time they were compared to some of the most prominent design firms around the country. Their names are, really relatively unknown today. While their names may not be familiar, however, you may be familiar with some of their work. Some of their trademarks, some of their designs have become part of the everyday our visual culture and vernacular. So these are a few logos that were designed by Morton Goldsholl and Goldsholl Design Associates. From the earliest, the loaded paintbrush for Martin Senior paints, to one that's very familiar and still in use, the Motorola trademark.
So today what we want to do is kind of give a little contextualization to the Goldsholls and really talk about how they emerged from Chicago specifically. So the specific kind of artistic, industrial, and media conditions of the city. And this kind of landscape includes the School of Design, which Lara has talked a little bit about. This was founded by the artist and educator László Moholy-Nagy in 1937. The city's position as kind of the central hub for communications and manufacturing, as well as its unique film industry, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this is an image from a film titled Night Driving, which was made by Morton and Millie in 1956. And I think it expresses both this mid-century landscape, the kind of commercial mid-century landscape at night, but it also shows the way that the Goldsholls were interested in, inspired by this landscape. They were interested in engaging with it, and they were also interested in using it as the kind of source material for their experimentation. So just to give you a little bit of background on the School of Design. So we've talked a little bit about when it starts. It starts in 1937. László Moholy-Nagy starts it as the American iteration of the German Bauhaus. And he creates a curriculum that's really based around experimentation. And so Morton and Millie Goldsholl, they begin studying there very early on, the very early years of the school in the late 1930s, early 1940s. They're inspired by this particular curriculum, this curriculum of experimentation, and more importantly, they're inspired by Moholy's introduction of film to this curriculum. Moholy believes that film is kind of the medium of the 20th century, and he decides to introduce a filmmaking curriculum here, which he wasn't able to do in Germany. And so Moholy also teaches all of this within a kind of particular ethos of social engagement, which really affects many of the designers that study there. So Morton and Millie are profoundly affected by the kind of idealism during their time. So both of them talk in later years about how transformative their experiences were at the School of Design. And so just as a quick example, Morton had already begun a career as a commercial artist during the Depression years. His work was mostly illustrative. After attending the school, his work radically changes. It's far more experimental. He's implementing these kind of avant-garde ideas. And this is an example of a light collage that he makes, or a slide collage that he makes, where he's bringing together materials like leaves, seeds, and these are colored gels that he cuts together. They're sandwiched between 2-by-2-inch slides, and then he's projecting them. So he's really interested in the way that these materials will be transformed by light. So obviously interested in the kind of work that's happening at the school with collage, with light, with projection. And this, of course, also influences his commercial work.
Yes. Yeah, just to pick up on some of the points that Amy was making, and throughout the exhibition and throughout this project, we've been thinking, of course, very consciously about why this happened in Chicago and why the Goldsholl firm could flourish in an environment like this. And as Amy mentioned, I mean, this is geographically the center of the nation, and of course there's so much manufacturing based here. And there's, as Laura was also alluding to, this period of incredible growth in the post-war period with corporations growing so exponentially and internationally. And the Goldshaw's worked a lot with companies based here in the Midwest, including the Martin Senior Company. And here's a wet paint sign from them. There was a paint company. They worked in the domestic sphere at the time. Now I think it's just an automotive paint company. But Goldsholl worked with them very early to create a whole visual, what they called a visual personality. They didn't really use the term branding at the time, but visual personality or visual identity campaign for Martin Senior that really helped revitalize the company. They came at all their projects from a really holistic approach, which included graphic design, but also in-store displays. They even went so far as to create a paint bar card where you had the colors of paint out along the side so you could easily match it to your furniture. And this, of course, is a period where people are very much focusing on their domestic spaces and they're focusing attention on the design of their homes. So there was a boom in business because of the work that the Goldshaw's were doing. They also even invented this machine that's very familiar to us now, but for mixing paint in the store, and they called it the Color Bot. But the graphics, I mean, just picking up on this Bauhaus aesthetic too, that is based here or flourishing here in Chicago because of the School of Design, they're starting to implement that in their work with, using this slanted sans serif type, combining photography and graphic design, the disembodied hand, of course, and conveying a message with very minimal means. Another campaign that they worked on, which I already had touched on, was Motorola. And at the time that they launched the logo that is still in use today, they also created this showroom for Motorola that was in the Merchandise Mart in Chicago. So this was opened in June of 1955, designed by Goldsholl Design Associates, and it was a space to showcase Motorola's products, clocks and radios and televisions, but just obviously looking at the space itself, it's very forward-looking, very futuristic and space age, and makes the trademark very prominent in the center of the photo here and in the design in the showroom generally. And combining these motifs of very high-tech electronic circuit boards with this image of the cosmos to really convey how this was fundamentally going to change our lives. So yeah, and this, the trademark itself was just thought of to be used in so many different ways by the company. So as, it would be embossed, it would be, on stationery, it would be on boxes, but it was endlessly adaptable. And that's something they were thinking about in their design also.
So the Goldsholls really start making a name for themselves with this corporate identity design, but they really secure their kind of position in the design field with their work in film. And they become known as designers in film. And so they turned to film in the mid-1950s. They turned to film in part because of the School of Design, because because Morton and Millie are introduced to film by Moholy-Nagy, but it's also because they're working in Chicago. So Chicago at the time, in the mid-1950s, was seen as the Hollywood for industrial or sponsored filmmaking. And this was a major sector of the film industry, one which we don't know as much about today, but at the time it was churning out like thousands upon thousands of films per year, kind of dwarfing what was happening in terms of Hollywood itself. And its central location was here in Chicago. So you get big companies like Encyclopedia Britannica Films, and I'm assuming or hoping some of you have seen those films, or Corinne, films produced by freelance producers. And these films were shown in auditoriums, in business meetings, in classrooms, in store or shop windows. They were shown everywhere. And in many ways, we can think about these films and the kinds of screens that they were being shown on as being a kind of early version of our current screen culture. So we often think of ourselves as living in a moment in which we're surrounded by screens, but people were also surrounded by screens as early as the 1950s. So these films played a major role in really shaping the experience of everyday life in mid-century. And so the designers at Goldsholl were really interested in applying some of these avant-garde techniques that they were experimenting with in their print designs to film. So we see an example like this here. This is a film called Sneeze. It's from a larger campaign called the Kleenex Experiments, in which the Goldshulls were trying to introduce a new package design and symbol design for Kleenex. So you have Morton Goldsholl sneezing these paper cutout flowers, and the petals from the flowers turn into the petal design on the Kleenex box. So you get this kind of merging of cutout animation, this kind of collage style with live action photography, with hand scratching, so literally scratching on the film emulsion. And these are really unusual techniques to see in commercial work at the time. So they're really bringing these kind of avant-garde, forward-thinking works, or approaches to their works. And so the Goldsholls also, around the same time, move into television, which was a very new medium at the time. Television was really introduced commercially or broadly in 1945, and they're bringing these same ideas to television.
And just to give you a little bit more context about the firm itself, and also what allowed them to create these really innovative projects and films, was this spirit of collaboration that was really part of the ethos of the studios. So this is a way to introduce you to some of the key players in the early days. On the left, Fred Nomia, Thomas Miller, and John Weber. Thomas Miller worked on the 7-Up campaign that is featured in the exhibition. Fred Nomia unfortunately died in 1959. John Weber also worked there for a long time. He's on the right. He was a calligrapher. I guess his nickname was the Wrist. And in the other photo, you see Morton, John Weber, and Susan Jackson Kaig, who was a designer there for also for many years. I mean, she was an important graphic designer here in Chicago. And, the photograph on the right, it's a staged photograph. I think it was taken for Communication Arts in 1963. And, but it also just really shows you how it's about talking. It's about working through problems together and collaboratively. I mean, it's a very different, for our reference point is Mad Men. This is a very different approach. And they were also just open to drawing on talent and many different voices from the city. So, and one of the other designers who was at the firm, Jim Logan, was an engineer, and he and Morton would just love to play around in the studio, to experiment, see what they could do. John Logan built a machine called a harmonograph in order to create these kinds of images. They called them harmonograms, which trace like a pendulum of light or the movement of light, and it records it on film. And then this kind of experimentation would show up in work they were doing for corporate clients. So this was an ad that they did for Kimberly-Clark for a new kind of paper called Texoprint that Kimberly-Clark was promoting.
So experimentation was certainly kind of the root for a lot of their work. They're first experimenting with materials, experimenting with light, and then bringing them into their commercial work. But Goldsholl Design Associates was also invested in creating non-client driven work. And a lot of this was led by Millie Goldsholl herself. So these are two images from one of her best known works, Up is Down, for which the exhibition is named. It was produced in 1969, and it's really this social political parable that makes a statement about the Vietnam War, about the sort of rampant racism of the time, and social indifference. And it was made in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination and the subsequent uprisings here in Chicago and around the country. The Goldsholls distributed the film through the educational film distributor Pyramid, primarily to primary grades, and they made arrangements to have a portion of the proceeds go to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So it's also a film that, as you can see with the image on the right, is self-consciously about or thinking about the media industry, the industries that Millie and Morton and the Goldsholl firm was engaged in. It offers a kind of critique of television and consumerism as being things that might distract us from more important or more pressing social issues. And it's also even offering up this idea that kind of questioning the role of mass media in general as the thing through which we learn about the world. So she's really kind of struggling with this in this particular film. And so I think that this film harkens back to her early training at the School of Design. It certainly comes out of the social environment of the firm itself and her other kind of political and social work. And it demonstrates a real ongoing engagement with the field. So it's one of the pieces that, for us, it closes our exhibition, and it's a way for us to kind of open up onto these other kinds of questions that the Goldsholls were asking of themselves as designers, questions about representation, questions about media, questions about their role in the larger world, and just questions about what was happening as the world was becoming sort of increasingly media saturated throughout mid-century.
Thank you, Amy and Corinne. Finally, artist, planner, community organizer, and University of Chicago professor Theaster Gates will discuss the recent exhibition, A Johnson Publishing Story, at the Rebuild Foundation. The exhibition explores the enduring role of Ebony and Jet magazines in defining and popularizing a Black aesthetic and identity around the globe. Theaster.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to maybe first start off by suggesting that the project, A Johnson Story, was really a kind of an artistic attempt to demonstrate that there was still life in an old company. That in some ways, Johnson, not unlike the Bauhaus move from Weimar to Chicago, Johnson's legacy, say the value of the company, was not only in the fact that it produced amazing Black images, but there was also something about the life of the company that helped Black Americans aspire. The aspiration was part from the imagery within the magazines, Ebony, Jet, Tan, Hue, Reader's Negro Digest, Black World. But it was also that the organization, that the corporation existed, that was also a kind of black aspiration. John Johnson and Eunice Johnson were of the most important and most successful corporations of the 1960s. And if we could all imagine for a moment, you mentioned Time magazine, Lara. Imagine 1945, 46, you're an African American or an Asian American in the United States, and you are doing what all Americans do. You're cleaning your house, you're going to work, you're taking care of your kids. But nowhere in, say, Reader's Digest or Life magazine do you see yourself reflected. And I think that the genius of John Johnson was that he understood the urgency that black people had to be seen by themselves and maybe perhaps seen among their white colleagues as equals. And so John Johnson was looking immediately at Life magazine and kind of replicating that with Ebony, looking immediately to Reader's Digest and saying, not only do I want to see the television series of white America, I want to see the television series that reflect my experience. And so that first move of just wanting to image a black person was a radical act. And that you would then build a kind of a corporate structure around imaging black people was super radical. I've learned over time that there were other organizations that were kind of complementary organizations. So an organization called Black Star that provided stock imagery of black people doing cool things. So if Johnson Publishing, in advance of them having their own internal team, needed black people playing volleyball on a beach, that there was a company they could call that could have these models get permission on an all-white beach to perform volleyball for a moment, capture this image that then would help black people around the world aspire to spending time in South Carolina or going to any of the intended middle-class black beaches around the country, 1955. It's hard for me sometimes to imagine when I look at some of the earlier issues of Ebony, the restrictions that existed, and now when you look at Vogue, especially Great Britain's Vogue, and you see the tremendous acceptance of the black image, its proliferation over the last 15, 20 years, it's hard to imagine that there was an absence or an erasure of the black image at all. But in fact, the innovation was that he was willing to make that image clear. I should say the Johnson story for me was an attempt, I guess this requires that I give you guys a little bit of kind of background. Johnson Publishing was liquidating their assets, including the building that they own. The building was eventually sold to Columbia College with the understanding that Columbia College was going to create in the penthouse a museum that was kind of like a legacy piece for the Johnson Company. Columbia College was not able to raise the resources necessary to create the museum, and it meant that everything in the building needed to go away, but also then John Johnson's penthouse needed a home. So one portion of my practice feels like it's in a constant state of rescuing objects that are in a moment of traumatic experience. So it's like, it's not exciting to get a call and say, I don't have a place for my things, and it's 50,000 square feet of carpet or wallpaper or lighting, or in fact, John Johnson's awards, his waterbed, his barbershop, his weight room. But when you get that call, that's a call that's in a state of a traumatic experience because his daughter is calling saying that these things that have been important to me and been a part of my life, all of my life, they need a home. We don't have a home, and we have about 2 weeks. Right? And so part of what I'd want to kind of offer is that you have this amazing mogul, this amazing publishing company, and we're talking in some ways about the history of images, the history of the platforms that created those images. But what happens when the structure of the platform shifts away from an analog image or away from 16 millimeter image toward a digital image? And what happens when the pioneer and maverick of that corporation dies? And then the company has to then try to make these pivots without its innovator or entrepreneur. And so we found ourselves with a lot of furniture. These images were taken just before we made an intervention to remove the books, the furniture, essentially everything we could unscrew or sawzall out, with no real clarity about what would happen with the things, just understanding that they needed a home. So in order to do this, it meant getting on the phone with everybody I knew who had a warehouse and saying, could you guys give us a warehouse? Then identifying professional movers that had the ability to be fast, affordable, and had the capacity to kind of care for precious things. When people talk about Johnson Publishing, they sometimes talk about the aesthetic as a kind of black modernism. What is black modernism? Let's say black modernism is modernism bought by a black person. It could also be that there were forms or companies like, say, IBM that made a really nice typewriter. The typewriter is black. And then Eunice Johnson says, well, I have patent leather red motif on my credenza. I would like my typewriter to be red patent leather. So Eunice Johnson calls IBM and says, I want all of my typewriters for the 7th floor to be red, alligator. And you see those things happening over and over as a kind of tribute to what I would imagine, 2 or 3 primary concerns in the late 60s, early 70s. That a black aesthetic would be bold, and that boldness would kind of announce pride and a kind of power. That there might be a rhythm in the boldness, and that rhythm might happen through pattern, texture, and that in some cases it would literally speak to blackness with words. And so you might have a couch that says, this is a black couch. No, it was never quite that. There was a lot of black power. And so I believe the couches that you're looking at, the carpet, I believe those things are in storage. And let's see if I can find a pointer. That beautiful gray stone centerpiece that's currently at the Stony Island Arts Bank. If I could for a moment, just kind of articulate how cold it is in this room. If I could articulate for a moment how much of a joy it was to work with Linda Johnson Rice and her team, and to also work with my staff, Brother Pete, Brother Devin, this brother named Tom Lineberger, to consider the restoration of these objects and then figure out who in the city could recondition these things so that we could kind of not only give tribute, but complete reactivation of the credenza. and that the reactivation would be much more exciting than just a historical artifact that had a vitrine over it. Y'all know what I'm saying? And that in some ways, the celebration of Johnson Publishing, for me at least, its height would be if we could actually build a new corporation out of the pre-existing corporation. That in fact, we wouldn't allow the corporation to die, but we would imagine that the pivot that needed to happen would function as a kind of germ for making new bread. And that we would kind of carry the DNA from Johnson Publishing and put that into a series of new platforms, whether it's Rebuild Foundation or my studio or the Black Image Corporation, that there was so much raw goodness that I wouldn't leave it to history or the historian to be the only ones who could deeply grapple and consider it. But in fact, could a new corporation teach us as much about the history or the legacy of Johnson Publishing as a paper? That is, could I make a new magazine, or could I make a new series of Black images? Could I redeploy Black images that have never been seen, because for every 200 shots, one would only see one image. For every 350 shots, one might see 2 to 3 images. And so the Arts Bank has become a temporary Johnson Publishing Corporation. And those things that had been just on the verge of homeless, or in a way, let's say, completely deactivated for an indefinite amount of time, if not thrown away, that they found, in fact, a super amazing home on the South Side. And maybe they're kind of coming home for the first time. John Johnson was smart enough not to ask the realtor for the land that eventually built the building. He sent in a white friend to actually make the land transaction. But could it be that these objects are kind of finding a home in a Black space for the very first time, and that the stories that populated Ebony and Jet and the Johnson Company, those stories have kind of found a permanent home in Black space on 72nd, on 68th and Stony Island? So we just wanted to kind of show you guys a few of the images, and then I would suggest that one of the things I'm excited about is that artists have a way of examining history, and in this case, examining the history of corporations by creating new forms. And I would say maybe even the examination of an old corporation might be most precise by creating a new corporation. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. There's really a lot to talk about. I think with all of our 3 presenters, fortunately we only have 5 minutes left. But so let me just say, Theaster, I think your proposal of reactivation as the artistic mode of contending with legacy is extraordinarily, it really brings the task of memorialization in the present right into the foreground. And so I'm really quite taken with your articulation of precisely that activity. The very idea of a corporation being formed in order to maintain the legacy of a corporation is a curious idea to me. And I think what I'd like maybe, or the idea that there was some dormancy in the original procurement of real estate, and I think as you quite powerfully presented, that this Black image and Black aesthetic now finds a home that it was originally intended for. And I wonder if in all of these situations with the Container Corporation as another kind of legacy building, but one in which one doesn't have to sort of create images to circulate for aspirational. The aspiration is already pre-programmed through so-called Western history. I don't really have a question. I'm more
That's
sort of
good.
like really interested in how these varied communities of design and image making in many ways kind of spoke to each other or spoke sort of beyond each other in a way. And this seems to me right now a moment where they are speaking to each other right now, not in that, Chicago in the 1950s, maybe Goldsholl was maybe a kind of presence in which these two entities were speaking to each other. But now this moment is ripe for that kind of conversation.
Want to help you? It seems for those who are kind of keepers of history, there are certain paths for the care of history and the redeployment of history that are really clearly laid. The museum is a place where history lives, let's say.
Or goes to die.
Let's say. Or a paper or a book. Those are forms that we understand where if you're writing about or you're trying to shed light on a past, those are forms, let's say, platforms or forms that make sense. And I think for me, one of the things that I've been trying to do is rather than critique pre-existing forms that platform the amazing legacies, in this case of the Container Company, that maybe there are ways that I could invent another form. And the form that I chose was in fact a tribute. To choose the corporation is a tribute to John Johnson. That becomes the precise form, because I believe John would want me, if I could say, John would want me to keep making money. John would want to keep producing black images. John would want to maintain black radicality. And so in this case, I was just trying to figure out how could one do that? And it seems like he employed a couple thousand people in Chicago over 70 years. That felt like the right kind of tribute, right? So in some ways, I think that I'm also just kind of trafficking in form making. And in this case, rather than just putting a black image on a t-shirt as the final form, I thought creating an LLC could be an interesting way to give tribute.
Any questions from our audience before we wrap things up here?
And if you have any questions, I'm going to walk around with a microphone. Just before we open for question and answer, I did want to note that at the end of this discussion, we do have 2 books that will be for sale. One is Art in Chicago, A History of the Fire from till now. And it will be sold by the University of Chicago Press, funded by the Terra Foundation for American Art, as well as the Johnson Publishing catalog. So are there any questions? Yes.
All right, so I just want to say fantastic presentations across the board. Theaster Gates, the work you're doing is incredible. But my question goes to Amy and Corinne. The work, the avant-garde, the engineering, inventions, and everything that came out of that movement, it sounds like something of a bygone era. Do you know of any examples in advertising and marketing where you still see that kind of work coming about? Or do you think that is kind of a relic of the past?
Well, no, I just wanted to say, I mean, one thing that just you notice when you're in the exhibition and looking at this work is that it just, I mean, it's such a different time because there's, for example, one Revlon commercial from like around 1970, and it has a woman's face that's all pixelated, and I mean, you know, we're at a university and we have students coming to the exhibition, and for them, it's just means clicking a button to make that happen. But for Morton, Goldsholl and his associates, I mean, it was hours and hours of painstaking work to make these contraptions and devices that would create that effect. But yeah,
So I guess, I mean, the firm is all geared towards producing these packages and these images. So having an engineer on staff is in part to engineer these kind of new forms and new images. And I think you do see that with both designers today as well as artists. I mean, I feel like we're seeing that throughout this exhibition, throughout the expo. I mean, artists who are sort of shape-shifting, who are working collaboratively, who are working in different kinds of facets, either image making or making the structure that through which some other kinds of works exist. So I definitely do not think that that form is dead. I think it's continuing to kind of change and morph and is still with us today, or that kind of working method.
We have another question over here.
So I have a question for Theaster, actually. So over here, sorry. I was gonna say you're on the left, but the other side. So I apologize, I came in a little late. I hope you didn't already address this question, but when we talk about reactivating spaces or legacies, oftentimes we come by things we didn't expect. It's a learning process as we go. And I wonder, when you were working with, the Johnson legacy and the art bank, were there any individuals or were there any forces which you didn't expect would propel your vision or change your vision, and how did you adapt as those came up?
Yeah, whoa. So I think there was like a kind of ongoing series of surprises where the deeper in we got and the more trust was built between my team and the company. Like we licensed the rights to 20,000 of the 4 million images, which meant we had to scan. We got to about 13,000 images. So it meant that we actually moved a team of scanners and graphic designers and data specialists into the Johnson company, and we paid desk rent, so that we could be present with the rest of the company, and we were a kind of parasite, or at least, I don't know, a second liver, or everybody on my team was like cute, and smart, and so a tremendous amount of trust started to grow between the members of the Johnson staff and my staff, until it was kind of like we were just one big staff, all working toward the preservation and amplification of these images. We didn't expect that. The one sister that I want to give a shout out is this woman named Vicky, who's been the librarian since for 30 years. And so Vicky knew where all the images were. So if I was like, hey Vicky, what do you have on sororities? I don't know, black sororities. She could be like, oh, the sororities are over there. And then there would be these things, and I think Devin could speak to this more because he was in the images every day. We would find a box, and the box would say, cross-dressing ball 1950. It's like, I want to check out the cross-dressing ball of 1950. And you get in there and you realize that there are all these micro communities. One of the things I learned that was most exciting for me was that black is not a monolith. You know what I mean? And that the reporting that was happening, it was happening like high and low. And that I think for people who kind of have pleasure in going through the archive, like say aside from our research-based whatever, I think there's a part of us that just kind of gets off on going through the past. You know what I mean? And because there's so many surprises. But the thing that feels the most hardening is that when you get into it, you start to find that when people see that you honor the work, then they'll say, oh, my mom used to work for Ebony, or I used to work for Johnson Publishing, or I used to be a model, or I was an editor, I was a photographer, or we have more of those photographs. And so in some ways, by just celebrating and amplifying the work, you start to meet history. And that's good.
We have one more over here.
Thank you. I have a question for Lara Allison. all the images from the Container Corporation campaigns that you showed, first of all, it was great. But I couldn't help but thinking that we see every day, especially on social media, many of those quotes being misquoted or misappropriated or twisted by some other groups that sometimes they don't really have in mind the democratic values and liberal values. And in the current European and American scenario where we see a growing mistrust of media, capitalism, or even democratic values, do you think that such a campaign and such an impact could still take place right now? Or what would be the challenges, the obstacles? Can advertising still play a role in that? Or is it only up to the arts and museums and contemporary art to do that, if it still has that kind of credibility?
It's a great question. I've thought about that, especially in the current kind of political context in which we're living through, and this idea that we're, this feeling that we're more skeptical and kind of not. I guess I feel that we're as readers now, we're much more cynical because we're surrounded by so many kind of outlets of information and advertising and imagery, and so I think there's a kind of inability in a way to kind of look at things as to take it for example, if something like that ran today, I think we would be very skeptical in the sense that we would be like, that's a corporation. What's their end goal? What do they want? What is their advantage in doing this? I think of like the contemporary Nike campaign, and as an example of that, using imagery that is kind of much more kind of attempts to kind of divide or kind of produce some kind of political end rather than this, which was much more kind of meaning to. The intent was much more to kind of create a kind of inclusive idea of citizenship based on individualism. Not that there weren't problems with it, there certainly were. I don't want to idealize the campaign in any way, but I think that, I don't know that it would be possible today. Hopefully that answers your question, but it's.
We have one final question here.
Thank you. Actually, two, sorry, but they're quick. One is, Theaster, listening to you talk about corporations makes me think for the first time that it's okay that the Supreme Court says that corporations are people. And I'm wondering if you actually formed a corporation yet, or what direction you're going in. And then the other question I have is, are you in any kind of conversation with the Chicago Defender archives also? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about my colleagues on stage because in some ways, a corporation is people. But what I've learned is that the law, that people are protecting themselves. And so, but when I think about the kind of potentiality of a corporation, it's this possibility that more than one person can get together to do a thing that's good, amplify that thing in the world, and in this case, make some cash and pay some taxes. And all of that legal structuring is just about kind of taxes, really. But the tribute work, let's say, is for real. So I kind of like imaginary corporations where like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this thing? But I'm finding myself trademarking museum exhibition titles because they could have the potential to become a website or a platform or a company. And I think when I make companies, they're just kind of fun, they're like fun, So you make a company so that you have a purpose and a lane for calling a project something. So like some people just like make a journal and I like start a new LLC.
Well, thank you, everyone.
The Defender, I haven't been in touch with anyone from the Defender.
We're gonna break the rules. We're gonna let one more question.
Oh, okay.
Actually, sometimes affirmation is good. As a former Johnson Publishing Company employee, I hosted his television show. Thank you for honoring his legacy.
but really, I think I want to just kind of thank Terra Foundation again, because in some ways, the resources that are necessary for us to do this work, this is such a kind of pioneering platform, because not everybody's interested in history. Many people are only interested in the contemporary or the living. And so I think, Terra has been blazing a path that enables us to look at the past in new ways and bring it forward. And so I'm really honored to share this time with the panel. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all so much.